January 17, 1945. The skies above Achmer, Lower Saxony. The air is thin and cold at 25,000 feet. A young lieutenant named Franz Stigler pulls back the throttle of his Messerschmitt Me 262, feeling the twin Jumo 04 turbojets respond with a surge that presses him into his seat. The sensation is unlike anything the Luftwaffe has ever known. No propeller vibration, no tortured scream of a piston engine pushed beyond its limits. Just a clean, howling rush as the jet slices through frozen clouds at nearly 540 miles per hour. Below him, the German countryside spreads out like a torn quilt, pockmarked by craters and scorched earth. He banks left, scanning the horizon through the Revi gunsight, searching for the American bomber formations that have become as predictable as sunrise. His gloved fingers rest lightly on the control column. He is 23 years old. He believes he is piloting the future. The Me Tutor 62 Schwalbe, Swallow, is a masterpiece of desperate engineering. Its swept-wing design and axial flow turbojets represent a quantum leap in aviation, a technology so advanced that Allied intelligence officers will later admit they had underestimated German ingenuity by at least 2 years. When it first screamed across the sky in combat during the summer of 1944, Allied pilots reported encounters with an aircraft that seemed to violate the laws of physics. Lieutenant Colonel John B. Murphy of the 359th Fighter Group described it as a blur with flames coming out the back. Another pilot wrote in his after-action report, "I opened fire at what I thought was 400 yards. Before I could register hits, the bandit was gone. I never saw anything accelerate like that." For Franz Stigler and thousands of young German pilots like him, the Me 262 represented more than technological superiority. It was vindication, proof that the Vaterland, despite years of strategic bombing and the steady collapse of the Eastern Front, could still produce miracles. In the ready rooms at Achmer and Rheine-Hopsten and Lechfeld, the jet pilots spoke in reverent tones about the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapon that would turn the tide. They had flown the Bf-109 and the FW-190, magnificent aircraft in their own right but conventional. The 262 was different. It felt different. When you lit those turbojets and felt the acceleration, when you climbed at rates that made your vision gray at the edges, when you dove on a formation of B-17s and watched them grow from specks to enormous fortresses in a matter of seconds, you believed. You believed that genius and willpower could overcome material disadvantage. But belief, however fervent, cannot alter mathematics. And by January 1945, the mathematics of the air war over Germany had become brutally simple. The Messerschmitt Me TAC 862 program was born from brilliance constrained by chaos. As early as 1938, engineers at Messerschmitt had begun experimenting with turbojet designs, building on the pioneering work of Hans von Ohain. The first prototype flew on July 18, 1942, and the results stunned even the pessimists within the Reich Air Ministry. Here was an aircraft capable of speeds that rendered every existing fighter obsolete. Production began in earnest in 1944, with factories hidden in forests and underground facilities, dispersed to avoid the relentless Allied bombing campaign. By war's end, Germany had produced approximately 1,400 MBAUs in various configurations: fighter, bomber, reconnaissance. On paper, it was an overwhelming advantage. The jet could outrun, outclimb, and, when handled properly, outmaneuver any Allied fighter. Its 430mm Mk108 cannons delivered devastating firepower, each explosive shell capable of tearing through aluminum skin like paper. A 2-second burst into a B-17's wing could send the bomber spiraling earthward in flames. The Americans knew this. After the first encounters, the 8th Air Force issued urgent tactical bulletins. Avoid head-on passes with the 262. Do not attempt to chase it in level flight. warn bombers to tighten formations when jets appear. Yet the Me-262 pilots discovered something unexpected in those winter skies of 1945. They discovered that superiority in performance does not guarantee superiority in outcome. They discovered that war is not fought on drafting tables or in wind tunnels. War is fought in the grinding intersection of logistics, numbers, doctrine, and the unglamorous persistence of industrial capacity. Franz Stigler learned this lesson on his fourth combat sortie. He had taken off at dawn with 3 other jets, vectored toward an expected raid on rail yards near Hanover. The weather was marginal, scattered clouds at 8,000 feet, visibility reduced by industrial haze and smoke from burning refineries. His wingman, a veteran named Kepler who had transitioned from FW-190s, flew in loose formation 200 meters to his right. They climbed through the overcast, breaking into brilliant sunshine above the weather, and there, strung across the sky like beads on a wire, was the bomber stream. B-17s. Perhaps 60 of them in staggered combat boxes, their contrails sketching white lines against the blue. Around them, darting and weaving, were the escorts, P-51 Mustangs, their silver fuselages catching the light. Stigler counted at least 40 fighters. His pulse quickened. The tactical situation was exactly as briefed. Use superior speed to slash through the escort screen, make one high-speed pass on the bombers, then dive away before the Mustangs could react. Simple, efficient, theoretically unstoppable. He pushed the throttles forward and felt the jets respond, the acceleration pressing him back. The airspeed indicator climbed, 480, 500, 520. The bomber formation grew larger. He armed his cannons, finger resting on the trigger. The plan was to approach from the bomber's 6 o'clock high, dive through at a shallow angle, fire at the rearmost B-17, then use momentum to extend away in a high-speed dive. The Mustangs couldn't follow. Nothing could follow. Except they did. At 500 knots, Stigler rolled inverted and pulled through, starting his attack run. He had perhaps 3 seconds to line up the shot. The closing rate was phenomenal, the B-17 swelling in his gunsight with terrifying speed. He fired, saw strikes sparkling along a bomber's fuselage, then blew past the formation so fast he barely registered individual aircraft. Instinct took over. He lowered the nose, diving away at full throttle, expecting the clean escape every instructor had promised. Instead, tracer rounds snapped past his canopy. He cranked his head around. A Mustang, somehow, impossibly, was behind him, firing. Not close, but there, still in the fight. Stigler's mind raced. His airspeed was pushing 540 knots. The Mustang's maximum speed in level flight was maybe 440. He should have been pulling away effortlessly. But the American pilot had done something clever. He had started his dive before Stigler began his attack, building energy, positioning himself not to chase, but to intercept. The geometry wasn't about straight-line speed, it was about angles, about reading the battle 3 moves ahead. Stigler extended the dive, pulling out low over the winter fields, after images of tracer fire still burned into his retinas. His fuel state was already critical. The Jumo turbojets were ravenously thirsty, giving him perhaps 30 minutes of total endurance. He turned for Achmer, nursing the throttles, anger and confusion mixing in his chest. He had the fastest fighter in the world. How had a slower aircraft stayed in the fight? The answer, he would learn, was American innovation of a different kind. While German engineers had poured genius into aerodynamics and propulsion, American planners had been studying something more prosaic: doctrine. The United States Army Air Forces had spent 3 years learning how to fight over Europe, and they had learned brutally, losing thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of men. From that blood tuition came innovations that didn't require revolutionary technology. just relentless, systematic application of industrial-age warfare principles. When the Me-262 appeared, American intelligence didn't panic. They observed, they collected data, they interviewed pilots, analyzed gun camera footage, examined wreckage, and they realized the jet's advantages came with built-in vulnerabilities. The Me-262 was fast, but only at high speed. Its acceleration was impressive, but its turning radius at high speed was poor. It could dive away from almost any engagement, but it had to slow down eventually. To land, to line up a gun run, to operate at altitudes where its engines ran efficiently. Most critically, it was chained to a logistics network that was collapsing under the weight of strategic bombing. The Americans issued new tactical directives. Escort fighters were instructed to orbit near known jet bases, to patrol the approach corridors where Me-262s had to slow down for landing. P-51 and P-47 pilots began loitering at low altitude near Achmer Rhine and other jet fields, waiting. They called it rat catching. When a 262 came in to land, gear and flaps down, speed bled off, it was vulnerable. The jets still had superior performance in most regimes, but in those few minutes of approach and landing, they were just another airplane, slower than a Mustang, less maneuverable than a Thunderbolt. On February 25, 1945, a Me-262 pilot named Lieutenant Schraber was jumped by 4 P-51s as he lowered his landing gear 3 miles from Achmer. His aircraft, starved of fuel, couldn't accelerate quickly enough with the drag of extended gear. He tried to retract and escape, but was caught in a brutal crossfire. His jet tumbled into a forest in flames. He was the 11th Me-262 pilot lost in landing approaches that month. The Americans also adapted their bomber tactics. Instead of predictable, concentrated raids on specific targets, they began sending multiple smaller formations on divergent routes, forcing the jets to choose which threat to engage. More importantly, they flooded the sky with escorts. The 8th Air Force's philosophy became simple: accept that some bombers would be lost, but make the Germans pay an unsustainable price for every interception. By early 1945, American fighter production had reached levels that defied German comprehension. The United States was producing over 9,000 fighters per month, P-51s, P-47s, P-38s, rolling out of factories in massive, coordinated surges. Meanwhile, Me-262 production, despite Herculean efforts, never exceeded a few hundred per month, and many of those were lost to bombing before they ever reached operational units. But the deepest innovation wasn't tactical or numerical. It was philosophical. American air power doctrine had embraced something the Germans, for all their technical brilliance, had not: acceptance of attrition as a strategic tool. The United States could afford to lose aircraft, not because American lives were cheap, but because American industry was so overwhelmingly abundant that losses could be replaced faster than they were incurred. Every downed B-17 was mourned, but every downed B-17 was also replaced within weeks. Replacement crews arrived in England on a conveyor belt of training programs that graduated thousands of pilots monthly. The logistics network supporting the 8th Air Force included spare parts depots, fuel pipelines, maintenance battalions, and supply chains that stretched unbroken back to factories in Kansas and California. Germany, by contrast, was strangling. The synthetic fuel plants that fed the Me-262's turbojets were under constant attack. Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate New Year's Day offensive in 1945, had cost hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. The training pipeline had collapsed. New jet pilots were going into combat with 20 hours of flight time compared to the 300 hours American pilots received. Spare parts were scavenged from wrecks. Entire units stood down for lack of fuel. The Me-262, for all its technological majesty, was shackled to an economy that could no longer sustain high-intensity operations. Franz Stigler flew 17 more sorties in his Me 262. He shot down 3 American aircraft, a P-47, a B-24, and a P-51, whose pilot made the mistake of trying to turn with the jet at low speed. But he also watched 11 of his squadron mates die. 2 were shot down during landing approaches. 4 were killed when Allied fighter bombers caught their jets dispersed on the ground during a fuel shortage. 3 more were lost when their engines flamed out. The Jumo 004's turbine blades had a service life of just 10 to 25 hours, and replacement engines were scarce. One pilot, a boy named Fisher who was 19 years old, crashed on takeoff when his starboard engine ingested debris from a bomb-damaged runway. Stigler saw the fireball from the operations hut. On March 19, 1945, Stigler took off on what would be his final mission. The briefing had been grim. American fighter sweeps had been hammering jet bases all week, and fuel reserves were critically low. Each aircraft was allocated enough fuel for one mission: takeoff, intercept, and landing. No reserves for combat maneuvering, no allowance for diversions. The squadron was down to 6 operational aircraft. They were ordered to intercept a bomber raid on rail yards near Kassel. Stigler climbed through broken clouds, the turbojets shrieking behind him. He found the bomber stream, counted the escorts, too many, always too many, and began his attack run. The mechanics were the same: speed, surprise, a slashing pass, escape. But this time, as he dove through the formation and fired, his port engine began surging. The turbine temperature spiked into the red. He throttled back instinctively, felt the engine stabilize, but his speed was dropping. He was still faster than the escorts, but not by enough. Not by the comfortable margin he had once enjoyed. A Mustang latched onto his tail. The American pilot was good, patient, not trying to chase but herding Stigler, forcing him into a predictable vector. Stigler yanked the stick, pulling into a steep climbing turn, hoping the jet's superior climb rate would shake the pursuit. But the damaged engine coughed, and he lost precious speed. The Mustang stayed with him. Tracers flickered past. He heard impacts, sharp metallic cracks as rounds punched through his airframe. He dove, pushed the throttles forward despite the port engine's temperature alarm, dove through 5,000 feet, 4,000, 3,000. The Mustang followed, firing in short, disciplined bursts. Stigler's canopy, starred with cracks. He leveled out at treetop height, screaming across snow-covered fields at 500 knots, and finally, the Mustang broke off. Out of ammunition, perhaps, or unwilling to follow so low. Stigler limped back to Achmer with his port engine flickering on the edge of failure and a dozen holes in his fuselage. When he climbed out of the cockpit, his hands were shaking. The crew chief took one look at the damage and shook his head. "We can't fix this," he said quietly. "No parts." The Me 262 was pushed into a revetment and abandoned. 2 weeks later, British armor overran Achmer. Stigler survived the war. The jet did not. The tragedy of the Me 262 was not that it failed. It succeeded brilliantly within its technical parameters. The tragedy was that it represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what modern war had become. The Germans had built a weapon for duels, for individual brilliance, for the kind of warfare where superior technology and skill could carry the day. But by 1945, the war in the air over Europe was not about duels. It was about systems, about the grinding, unglamorous arithmetic of production and logistics. The Americans didn't need to build a better fighter than the Me 262. They just needed to build more fighters, train more pilots, deliver more fuel, and maintain more aircraft than the Germans could destroy. In the archives at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, there is a folder containing after-action reports from the 357th Fighter Group, one of the most successful Mustang units. The reports document 37 encounters with Me 262s between December 1944 and April 1945. The Germans shot down 16 American aircraft in those encounters, an impressive ratio. But the Americans shot down 21 Me 262s, mostly by exploiting the jet's vulnerabilities during takeoff, landing, or when their engines malfunctioned. More importantly, the 357th lost 16 aircraft and 16 pilots. Within 2 weeks, all 16 aircraft were replaced. All 16 pilot slots were filled. The squadron's operational tempo didn't falter. The Germans lost 21 jets and 21 pilots. Those losses were never made good. American innovation in this context wasn't about building a faster jet or a more powerful engine. It was about building a system that could absorb punishment and keep fighting, that could turn industrial might into sustained pressure, that could make attrition a weapon in itself. The P-51 Mustang was not technologically superior to the Me-262. It was slower, less heavily armed, and in a pure performance envelope, inferior in almost every metric. But the Mustang was reliable. It could be maintained by ground crews with basic tools. Its Packard-built Merlin engine could run for hundreds of hours between overhauls. It could operate from rough fields. It had the range to escort bombers deep into Germany and still have fuel to hunt on the way home. And most importantly, there were thousands of them. The symbolic object that haunted German jet pilots wasn't a weapon or a piece of technology. It was far more prosaic, the fuel gauge. Every flight in an Me-262 was a race against the clock, a careful calculus of range and endurance. Pilots learned to nurse the throttles, to plan every maneuver with an eye on fuel consumption. Ground crews learned to siphon fuel from damaged aircraft to keep operational jets flying. Entire missions were scrubbed because the fuel trucks didn't arrive. In his diary, one Me-262 pilot, name redacted in declassified documents, wrote, "We have the world's most advanced fighter, and we cannot fly it because we have no fuel. The Americans have unlimited gasoline. They fly 8-hour missions. We are allotted 30 minutes. That abundance, not just of fuel but of everything, was the true American innovation. The ability to project overwhelming material power to sustain it over years, to replace losses faster than they accumulated. It was unglamorous. It didn't fit the romantic narrative of individual heroism and technological genius, but it won wars. By April 1945, the Me-262 program had effectively collapsed. Jet bases were overrun by advancing Allied armies. Remaining aircraft were destroyed on the ground or abandoned for lack of fuel. A few pilots managed to surrender their jets intact, and American intelligence teams descended on them with barely concealed excitement. Engineers crawled over the aircraft, photographing every detail, marveling at the swept wings and axial flow turbojets. One American engineer, examining a captured 262 at Wright Field in Ohio, wrote in his notes, "This is easily 5 years ahead of anything we have in development. The Germans have done something remarkable here." But remarkable was not enough. In the summer of 1945, after the war in Europe had ended, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted extensive interviews with surviving Luftwaffe personnel. One question appeared repeatedly: why did the Me-262 fail to change the outcome? The answers were strikingly consistent: lack of fuel, lack of spare parts, lack of trained pilots, overwhelming numbers of enemy fighters. One former jet pilot, whose name is lost to history, gave an answer that captured the essential truth. We had the best aircraft in the world. But you cannot fight a modern war with a few hundred of the best aircraft. You need 10,000 adequate aircraft. The Americans understood this. We did not. There is a photograph, taken by a British Army photographer in early May 1945, that encapsulates the end of the Me 262 story. It shows a row of jets at Lechfeld, one of the last operational jet bases, sitting on a grass field with their noses pointed skyward at odd angles. The landing gear has been destroyed by retreating German troops to prevent the aircraft from being flown. In the foreground, a group of American soldiers poses in front of one jet, grinning, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. One soldier is standing on the wing. They look like tourists at a monument. In the background, visible but out of focus, is a line of American trucks and jeeps stretching to the horizon. The logistics train that had carried the Allies across Europe, that had delivered fuel and ammunition and food and spare parts in quantities the Germans could no longer imagine. The Americans didn't defeat the Me 262 by building a better jet. They defeated it by building a system that made the jet irrelevant. In the decades after the war, the Me 262 became a symbol of different things to different people. To aviation enthusiasts, it represented a glimpse of the future, a technological marvel born too late to change history. To military historians, it became a case study in the limitations of wonder weapons, a lesson in the importance of logistics and doctrine. To former Luftwaffe pilots, it was a bittersweet memory of what might have been, a last moment of technological superiority before the final collapse. But perhaps the truest lesson of the Me 262 is about the nature of innovation itself. The Germans innovated in the realm of pure engineering, creating an aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible. The Americans innovated in the realm of systems, creating a method of warfare that turned industrial capacity into sustained combat power. Both were innovations. Both were impressive. But only one was suited to the kind of total war that the Second World War had become. The jet age eventually arrived, of course. Within a decade of the war's end, both the United States and the Soviet Union had operational jet fighters that built on German research. The swept-wing, turbojet-powered design became standard. In that sense, the Me 262's legacy was profound. It shaped the future of aviation in ways that are still visible today. But in the immediate context of 1945, it was a magnificent irrelevance, a machine that demonstrated how technological brilliance, untethered from strategic reality, becomes merely a footnote. Franz Stigler survived the war and eventually emigrated to Canada, where he became an engineer. He rarely spoke about his time in the Me 262, but in a 1979 interview for a documentary, he said something that has stayed with historians. "We thought the jet would save us. We thought technology could overcome everything else. But the Americans taught us that war is not won by the best weapons. It is won by the ability to keep fighting after your best weapons are gone. They could afford to lose. We could not. That was the difference." On a clear afternoon in January 1945, a young German pilot sat in the cockpit of the fastest fighter in the world and believed he held the future in his hands. He was not wrong about the technology. The Me 262 was, in every measurable sense, a revolutionary aircraft. But he was wrong about what the future required. The future did not belong to the fastest jet or the most brilliant design. It belonged to the nation that could build, fuel, maintain, and replace 10,000 adequate aircraft, while its enemies struggled to keep a few hundred masterpieces in the air. The sky above Achmer is quiet now. The runways are overgrown. The revetments collapsed. The scars of war softened by 70 years of grass and weather. If you stand there in winter, when the air is thin and cold, you can almost imagine the sound of those turbojets, the shriek that once announced the arrival of something new and terrible. But the sound fades quickly, swallowed by the wind, because history has moved on. The lesson remains. In war, as in all human endeavors, genius constrained by scarcity will always yield to competence backed by abundance. The Me 262 was faster. The Mustang won. That is the cold arithmetic of modern conflict, and it admits no appeal.